847 hours. 63 Japanese fighters were converging on my position from 4 different vectors. I was flying a single P-40 Warhawk, with 17 minutes of fuel remaining and orders to maintain radio silence. My name was Captain Robert Neale, and according to every air combat manual in existence, I was about to become a statistic. Standard fighter doctrine against overwhelming numbers called for immediate disengagement, diving to low altitude, extending range at maximum speed. But 63, a 6M0s climbing from multiple directions, had already cut off every escape route, except one that defied every principle of aerial warfare. Archive records from December 1941 show that American fighter pilots operating in the China, Burma, India theater faced impossible odds on a daily basis. The American volunteer group, known as the Flying Tigers, fielded approximately 40 operational P-40 aircraft against the Japanese 14th Air Army's estimated 280 fighters and bombers. For every American fighter, Japanese forces deployed 7 aircraft. That mathematics meant individual American pilots would face multiple enemy aircraft in every engagement. Can you picture the tactical situation? Japanese air superiority in the region was absolute and unchallenged. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier-based fighters had destroyed American air power at Pearl Harbor, Clark Field, and Hickam Field. Japanese Army air forces controlled the skies over Burma, Thailand, and southern China. American pilots were fighting a delaying action with obsolescent aircraft against the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The Japanese pilots, converging on my position, averaged over 2,000 combat hours each, with many veterans of the China incident dating back to 1937. Squadron leaders like Lieutenant Commander Saburo Shindo had been perfecting their tactics for 4 years of continuous warfare across multiple theaters. These were not inexperienced pilots learning combat procedures. They were seasoned professionals who had developed coordinated attack techniques specifically designed to overwhelm isolated American aircraft through superior numbers and tactical coordination. The lead formation approaching from the northeast included pilots from the elite Tainan Air Group, responsible for some of the most devastating attacks on Allied airfields throughout the Pacific. Their standard operating procedure for engaging single enemy fighters involved a 3-phase attack: initial positioning to cut off escape routes, coordinated approach from multiple vectors to overwhelm defensive fire, and systematic destruction using minimum ammunition expenditure to preserve resources for additional targets. I was assigned to the 2nd Pursuit Squadron, American Volunteer Group, operating out of Kunming Airfield in southwest China. The American Volunteer Group, commanded by Claire Chennault, had been organized in April 1941, with the covert approval of President Roosevelt to provide air defense for Chinese forces against Japanese aggression. Officially, we were civilians employed by the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company. Unofficially, we were American military pilots fighting an undeclared war against the Japanese Empire. Our mission was simple in concept, impossible in execution: protect Chinese cities from Japanese bombing attacks using aircraft that were inferior in performance to enemy fighters and operating without adequate spare parts, ammunition, or fuel supplies. The P-40 Warhawk was a competent fighter aircraft designed by Donovan Berlin at Curtiss Wright Corporation, but it had been designed for combat against German aircraft over Europe, not Japanese fighters optimized for Pacific operations. Our aircraft were actually P-40B and P-40C models that had been diverted from British Lend-Lease shipments. The British Royal Air Force had rejected these particular aircraft as inadequate for combat against German Messerschmitt Bf-109s, considering them suitable only for training purposes. What the British considered inadequate for training, we were expected to use for combat against the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The irony was not lost on any of us. The problem was performance characteristics that favored Japanese aircraft in most categories that mattered for aerial combat. The Curtiss P-40 had a maximum speed of 378 miles per hour at 15,000 feet altitude, compared to the Mitsubishi A6M0's maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at the same altitude. The P-40 held the advantage in straight-line speed and diving performance due to its heavier construction and more powerful Allison engine. But the Zero could climb, and outmaneuver the P-40 at any altitude above 10,000 feet. The Zero's service ceiling was 32,810 feet, while the P-40's service ceiling was only 29,000 feet. This altitude disadvantage meant that Japanese fighters could always position themselves above American formations. Japanese pilots knew these performance differences and employed tactics specifically designed to exploit American aircraft weaknesses while avoiding situations where American advantages could be employed effectively. Do you understand the fundamental problem facing American pilots? Japanese fighters could choose when and where to engage. They could climb above American formations, select optimal attack positions, coordinate multiple aircraft against single targets, and disengage whenever tactical conditions became unfavorable. American pilots could only react to Japanese initiatives, never dictate the terms of aerial combat. Reports from Flying Tiger's pilots consistently describe the same tactical pattern. Japanese fighters would climb to altitude, organize coordinated attacks, approach American formations from multiple vectors simultaneously, then execute diving passes that exploited their numerical superiority. Standard American defensive tactics emphasized mutual support, coordinated maneuvering, and maintaining formation integrity. But these tactics required multiple aircraft, and American squadrons rarely had enough operational fighters to maintain effective formations. The situation on the 23rd of December 1941 represented the tactical nightmare that every American pilot in China faced eventually. I was flying a lone patrol over the Burma Road supply route, specifically the section between Lashio and Kunming, where Japanese fighters frequently intercepted supply convoys. The weather conditions were marginal. Scattered clouds at 12,000 feet with visibility reduced to 8 miles due to seasonal haze and smoke from burning villages along the road. Surface winds were from the northeast at 15 knots, creating moderate turbulence that affected aircraft handling at lower altitudes. My P-40, tail number 68, had been named Hell's Bell by the previous pilot, who had been shot down 3 weeks earlier during a raid on Hanoi. The aircraft had accumulated battle damage from previous missions, bullet holes patched with aluminum sheet metal, hydraulic lines rerouted around damaged sections, and the radio antenna jury rigged after taking hits from Japanese fighters. When Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted my P-40 at 18,000 feet altitude, I was flying at reduced throttle setting to conserve fuel. My fuel gauge showed 17 minutes of flight time remaining at current power setting, barely enough to reach Kunming airfield if I maintained optimal cruise conditions. Within 12 minutes of being spotted, 63 Japanese fighters from 3 different airfields were climbing toward my position with the obvious intent of destroying the isolated American aircraft before it could return to base. The Japanese response demonstrated their tactical coordination and overwhelming numerical superiority. Radio intercepts later revealed that the operation involved aircraft from the 64th Air Regiment based at Hanoi, the 77th Air Regiment operating from Bangkok, and carrier-based fighters from the aircraft carrier Akagi, which had been diverted from operations in the South China Sea specifically to eliminate Flying Tiger's aircraft. This level of coordinated response to a single American fighter demonstrated how seriously Japanese commanders viewed the threat posed by American pilots operating in China. The mathematics of aerial combat were simple and unforgiving. 63 enemy fighters against 1 American aircraft meant that even if I achieved a perfect kill ratio of 1 enemy fighter destroyed for each firing pass, I would exhaust my ammunition after approximately 8 seconds of combat. The P-40 carried 6.50 caliber machine guns, with 235 rounds per gun, totaling 1,410 rounds of ammunition, at a cyclic rate of 750 rounds per minute per gun. Maximum rate fire would deplete all ammunition in approximately 19 seconds. Standard evasive tactics would not work against such overwhelming numerical superiority. Diving away from the engagement would only delay the inevitable interception. The Japanese fighters could pursue in relays, with fresh aircraft taking up the chase, as others ran low on fuel. Attempting to fight would result in being overwhelmed within seconds by coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Surrender was not an option for Flying Tiger's pilots. Capture by Japanese forces meant torture and execution. But there was another option that violated every principle of fighter tactics and survival that I had been taught during my training at Randolph Field in Texas. Instead of running away from the Japanese formation, what if I flew directly toward them? Not to attack, but to create a tactical situation so unexpected, so contrary to logical behavior, that it might achieve psychological effects that firepower could not. The concept defied everything I had learned about aerial combat survival. Lieutenant Colonel Claire Chennault, our commanding officer, had repeatedly emphasized that P-40 pilots must never attempt to dogfight with Japanese fighters under any circumstances. The performance disadvantage was too great. American pilots were instructed to use superior diving speed and firepower concentration to achieve hit and run attacks, never remaining in the combat area longer than absolutely necessary to deliver an attack. Fighting multiple Japanese fighters simultaneously was considered suicidal, something that competent pilots simply did not attempt. But the mathematical reality of my situation made conventional wisdom irrelevant. I was already dead according to traditional tactical analysis. Conventional escape was impossible. Conventional fighting was hopeless. The only remaining option was unconventional action that might create opportunities where none existed using standard procedures. The head-on approach would force Japanese fighters to make immediate tactical decisions without adequate coordination time. Fighter formations attacking isolated targets rely on predetermined attack plans that maximize their numerical advantage while minimizing individual risk. When target behavior becomes unpredictable, coordinated attack plans become useless, forcing individual pilots to improvise responses without formation support. This tactical uncertainty could be exploited by aggressive action that appeared suicidal but was actually calculated to create enemy mistakes. Witnesses from the Chinese ground observation posts recalled what happened next. Chinese army observers positioned along the Burma Road maintained constant watch for Japanese aircraft, using field telephones to report enemy movements to Allied air defense networks. Instead of diving toward low altitude and attempting to escape as expected, my P-40 climbed directly toward the approaching Japanese formation at full throttle, not climbing to achieve tactical advantage, but climbing to create a head-on approach that would force the Japanese fighters to make immediate tactical decisions without time for coordination or planning. Chinese observers noted that the American aircraft's approach appeared suicidal, but they also observed immediate changes in Japanese formation behavior that suggested tactical confusion among enemy pilots. The lead Japanese formation began making erratic heading and altitude changes that disrupted their coordinated approach plan. Individual aircraft within the formation started maneuvering independently rather than maintaining formation discipline. The effect was immediate and psychologically devastating. Japanese fighter formations were trained to attack individual aircraft that were attempting to escape or defend themselves using conventional evasive maneuvers. They were not prepared to engage an American fighter that was aggressively approaching their formation in a head-on attack profile. The lead Japanese pilots faced an immediate tactical dilemma: continue their coordinated attack plan against a target that was no longer behaving predictably, or modify their tactics to address an unexpected threat that defied standard enemy behavior patterns. Post-war interviews with captured Japanese pilots revealed the psychological impact of encountering aggressive tactics from numerically inferior American forces. Commander Saburo Shindo, who participated in air operations over China during 1941 and 1942, stated during interrogation that American pilots who attacked instead of retreating created serious tactical uncertainty among Japanese formations. Shindo noted that Japanese pilots were trained extensively for coordinated attacks against defensive targets, but received minimal training for scenarios where enemy aircraft behaved aggressively despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. When familiar tactical patterns no longer applied, individual pilots made individual decisions that disrupted overall formation coordination. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, one of the primary architects of Japanese naval aviation tactics, acknowledged in post-war analysis that American aggressive tactics had forced significant modifications to Japanese pilot training and tactical procedures throughout the Pacific theater. The head-on approach created multiple simultaneous problems for the Japanese formation. First, it compressed the time available for coordinated attack planning from several minutes to approximately 30 seconds. Second, it forced Japanese pilots to choose between maintaining formation discipline and taking individual evasive action. Third, it created a closing speed between opposing aircraft of over 700 miles per hour, reducing the time available for accurate gunnery to less than 2 seconds. Most importantly, it forced Japanese pilots to make split-second decisions about collision avoidance while simultaneously trying to achieve firing solutions against a rapidly approaching target. Here's what happened when individual psychology meets group dynamics under combat stress. The human brain defaults to familiar patterns when facing unexpected situations. Japanese pilots had trained extensively for coordinated attacks against defensive targets. They had not trained for scenarios where enemy aircraft attack superior numbers. When familiar tactical patterns no longer applied, individual pilots made individual decisions that disrupted overall formation coordination. The principle of aggressive action against superior numbers creates psychological effects that transcend pure military mathematics. Attackers expect defensive behavior from outnumbered opponents. When outnumbered forces attack instead of defending, the psychological impact exceeds the physical threat. Enemy forces must reassess their assumptions about opponent capabilities and intentions. This reassessment creates hesitation, confusion, and tactical uncertainty that can be exploited by innovative tactical thinking. Understanding this principle allows smaller forces to achieve tactical effects against larger opponents through psychological pressure rather than firepower superiority. The key is creating unexpected tactical situations that force enemy commanders to make rapid decisions without adequate planning time. Modern military doctrine recognizes this as a fundamental principle of asymmetric warfare applicable to any situation where conventional force ratios favor the enemy. This tactical approach requires accepting higher risk in exchange for higher potential impact. Aggressive action against superior numbers increases immediate danger to friendly forces. But passive defensive action against overwhelming odds guarantees defeat through attrition. Sometimes the highest probability of survival requires accepting tactics that appear more dangerous but create opportunities for enemy mistakes. After action reports from the 23rd of December engagement noted several significant tactical results that exceeded all expectations for single aircraft survival against such overwhelming odds. First, the Japanese formation lost coordination when individual pilots reacted differently to the unexpected head-on approach, with some pilots attempting to maintain their original attack vectors while others initiated evasive maneuvers that interfered with adjacent aircraft. Second, several Japanese aircraft collided while attempting simultaneous evasive maneuvers in the same airspace, resulting in the loss of at least 2 confirmed enemy fighters without any expenditure of American ammunition. Third, the coordinated attack plan dissolved into individual combat actions that allowed the P-40's superior diving speed to be employed effectively during the escape phase of the engagement. Intelligence reports from Chinese ground observers confirmed that the Japanese formation took approximately 8 minutes to reorganize after the initial disruption, during which time I was able to dive to low altitude and escape toward Kunming airfield using terrain features to mask my aircraft from visual detection. My P-40 reached Kunming with less than 3 minutes of fuel remaining, landing with the fuel gauge indicating empty tanks. Post-flight inspection revealed no battle damage, despite passing through a formation of 63 enemy fighters, though several bullet holes in the wingtips suggested that some Japanese pilots had achieved firing solutions during the high-speed pass. The aircraft's Allison engine had operated at maximum power for 17 minutes during the escape, exceeding normal operational limits, but demonstrating the reliability of American aircraft systems under extreme conditions. Most significantly, the engagement demonstrated that individual American pilots could survive encounters with overwhelming Japanese numerical superiority by employing tactics that exploited psychological vulnerabilities, rather than relying on technological or numerical advantages that did not exist. But the most important result was psychological rather than tactical. Japanese intelligence reports, captured after the war from the archives of the Combined Fleet Air Force headquarters in Tokyo, revealed that the incident was studied extensively by Japanese naval aviation commanders and incorporated into tactical analysis documents distributed throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. Captain Minoru Genda, who served as Air Operations Officer for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, wrote a detailed analysis of American aggressive tactics that was circulated to all carrier-based fighter squadrons in February 1942. Genda's report concluded that American fighter pilots were employing irrational tactics that contradicted established air combat doctrine, making their behavior difficult to predict and counter using standard Japanese tactical procedures. The report recommended modifications to Japanese pilot training that would prepare aviators for encounters with American pilots who attacked, instead of defending when facing overwhelming odds. Japanese pilot training was modified to include scenarios involving aggressive action by numerically inferior forces, but the training proved inadequate for the psychological reality of facing determined opponents who appeared willing to sacrifice themselves rather than accept defeat. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Ataya, who commanded fighter squadrons during operations over China and later during the attack on Pearl Harbor, acknowledged in post-war interviews that American aggressive tactics created unprecedented tactical uncertainty that undermined Japanese pilot confidence and tactical planning procedures. Ataya noted that Japanese formations began experiencing coordination problems when facing American fighters, even in situations where Japanese numerical superiority should have guaranteed tactical success. The psychological impact was measurable in combat statistics and pilot behavior reports, filed with Japanese military headquarters throughout 1942 and 1943. The tactical innovation spread throughout American fighter squadrons in China within weeks. Flying Tigers pilots began employing head-on attacks against superior numbers when escape was impossible. Captain David Texas Hill was the first pilot to employ similar tactics during a mission over Rangoon, achieving similar psychological effects. The innovation became formal doctrine through combat experience, rather than official tactical development procedures. Claire Chennault incorporated aggressive defensive tactics into Flying Tigers training procedures, requiring all pilots to practice head-on approaches against simulated superior numbers. The tactic did not guarantee survival, but it achieved better results than defensive maneuvering against coordinated attacks. More importantly, it created psychological uncertainty among Japanese pilots, who could no longer predict American tactical behavior. Japanese fighter effectiveness against isolated American aircraft decreased measurably during early 1942. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese pilots were more cautious when engaging single American fighters, often breaking off attacks when American aircraft maneuvered aggressively instead of defensively. The tactical innovation had achieved strategic effects by undermining Japanese pilot confidence and predictable tactical patterns. Word of the tactic reached American fighter squadrons throughout the Pacific theater through official intelligence reports and informal pilot networks that operated independently of formal military communication channels. The 8th Fighter Group, operating from bases in the Philippines, reported similar results when employing aggressive tactics against superior numbers during the final weeks of the Philippine campaign in April. In May 1942, Captain Jesus Villamor, commanding Filipino pilots flying P-40 aircraft, documented several engagements where head-on attacks against Japanese formations achieved tactical success despite overwhelming numerical disadvantage. Villamor's squadron faced impossible odds during the defense of Bataan Peninsula, but managed to disrupt Japanese air attacks through aggressive tactics that prevented coordinated bombing runs against American defensive positions. The 49th Fighter Group in Australia incorporated head-on attacks into standard training procedures for outnumbered engagements after receiving detailed reports about Flying Tiger's tactical innovations. Group Commander Colonel Paul Wurtsmith ordered comprehensive training programs that taught pilots to recognize situations where aggressive action offered better survival prospects than conventional defensive maneuvering. The training emphasized psychological preparation as much as tactical technique, because pilots had to overcome natural survival instincts that favored defensive action when facing superior numbers. Lieutenant Colonel Neil Kirby, who later received the Medal of Honor for actions over New Guinea, credited aggressive tactics learned from Flying Tiger's experience with enabling his squadron to achieve tactical success against overwhelming Japanese numerical superiority throughout the New Guinea campaign. Kirby documented numerous engagements where individual American pilots faced multiple Japanese fighters and survived through head-on attacks that disrupted enemy coordination rather than conventional evasive maneuvering that had proven ineffective against determined opponents. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate tactical effects. Japanese naval aviation began reporting that American fighter pilots exhibited unpredictable behavior patterns that complicated attack planning. Japanese tactical manuals were revised to account for aggressive defensive tactics by numerically inferior American forces. Fighter training emphasized flexibility and individual initiative, rather than rigid adherence to coordinated attack procedures. Combat statistics from early 1942 revealed the broader impact. American fighter pilots facing overwhelming odds achieved survival rates 30% higher when employing aggressive tactics compared to defensive maneuvering. Japanese fighter units reported longer engagement times and reduced kill ratios against American forces using innovative tactics. The innovation was changing the mathematics of aerial combat through psychological rather than technological means. But success in individual engagements could not overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages. American air power in the Pacific remained numerically inferior until industrial production could replace losses and provide reinforcements. The tactical innovation bought time and saved lives, but it could not substitute for adequate aircraft numbers and pilot replacements. The strategic significance became apparent during the Doolittle raid in April 1942. American bomber crews used similar aggressive tactics when intercepted by Japanese fighters over Japan. Instead of attempting defensive formations, individual bombers attacked Japanese fighters head-on, disrupting coordinated intercept procedures and achieving higher survival rates than expected. The psychological impact on Japanese home defense planning was significant. Post-war analysis revealed that the tactical innovation influenced Japanese defensive planning throughout the Pacific War. Japanese commanders could no longer assume that numerically inferior American forces would behave defensively. Defensive planning had to account for aggressive American tactics that defied conventional military logic. This uncertainty complicated Japanese strategic planning and resource allocation. Captain Neale completed 47 combat missions in China and was credited with 16 confirmed aerial victories. But his most significant contribution was the tactical innovation that saved hundreds of American pilots facing impossible odds. After returning to the United States, he served as an instructor pilot teaching aggressive tactics to new fighter pilots. His training methods emphasized psychology and innovation over conventional doctrine, preparing pilots to survive impossible situations through creative thinking, rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. The legacy of aggressive tactics against superior numbers extends far beyond World War II fighter combat. Modern military doctrine incorporates the principle that psychological effects can multiply the impact of limited physical capabilities. Special operations forces routinely employ tactics designed to create psychological uncertainty among numerically superior opponents. Electronic warfare systems achieve effects through deception and confusion rather than direct destruction. Modern fighter aircraft doctrine emphasizes aggressive engagement principles that prioritize psychological disruption over numerical advantage. The principle that psychological effects can multiply limited physical capabilities has become fundamental to modern military thinking across all operational domains. Perhaps the most important legacy is the recognition that conventional military wisdom sometimes fails under extreme circumstances. When traditional tactics guarantee defeat, survival requires innovative thinking and acceptance of higher immediate risk in exchange for better long-term outcomes. Military training now emphasizes creative thinking and adaptation under pressure, rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. Did one pilot's decision to attack, instead of retreat, change the outcome of the Pacific War? Military historians continue to debate the significance of individual tactical innovations, but the innovation demonstrates that human psychology can be as powerful as technology in determining combat outcomes. Sometimes the most effective weapon is doing something that defies logical expectations. What would you have done when faced with impossible odds and no chance of escape? Would you have followed doctrine and attempted to run? Or would you have tried something that every manual said was suicidal? Sometimes survival requires breaking every rule you've been taught, because the rules were written for different circumstances than the ones you are facing. If these forgotten tactical innovations that saved lives and shaped modern warfare matter to you, hit that notification bell and help preserve the lessons that most military historians never discuss. These stories survive only when we remember them together, and the principles they demonstrate remain as relevant today as they were in the skies over China.